This episode is brought to you by the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation and its Montana-based AMB West Philanthropies, both of which embody the value-based approach to philanthropy and business of their chairman, Arthur M. Blank. The foundation is doing excellent and impactful work in Montana and beyond, so I encourage you to check out their website at blankfoundation.org to learn more. Thanks a lot. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Liz Moore. Liz is the executive director of the Montana Nonprofit Association, an organization whose mission is to provide leadership for Montana's nonprofit sector and partner with charitable nonprofits to promote a sustainable, networked, and influential sector. Founded in 2001, the MNA provides capacity, resources, and networking opportunities that allow Montana's diverse and numerous nonprofit organizations to increase their effectiveness and better serve the communities and citizens of Montana. As you'll hear in this conversation, Liz loves Montana and has devoted her career to the service of others. And her passion for making her home state an even better place is both inspiring and infectious. As some of you already know, my full-time job is in the nonprofit sector. I'm the conservation director at a regional land trust here in southeastern Colorado. Prior to moving into the nonprofit sector, I spent all of my career in the business world. But despite serving on several nonprofit boards and advisory committees, I still do not have a full understanding of the critical role of nonprofits, especially here in the West. And it wasn't until I was a year or so into my nonprofit conservation work that I realized just how critical nonprofits are to the functioning of society in the West. Nor did I understand how they complement the work of businesses and governmental entities. So I was thrilled to have Liz join me to talk about all of these issues, and I hope that you'll gain a deeper appreciation for why nonprofits are just so important here in the West. Liz and I connected virtually and had a wide-ranging conversation about the invaluable role of nonprofits in Montana and beyond. We started out talking about why Montana has such a large number of nonprofits per capita and why Montana's unique geography makes nonprofits such an important part of the culture. We talk about why Montanans are more involved in the community than what you see in many other regions of the United States. And we also talked a lot about COVID's impact on rural communities of Montana and how nonprofits were uniquely positioned to provide immediate and long-term relief to the unprecedented challenges created by the pandemic. We talk about Liz's work on Montana's Coronavirus Relief Task Force and how and why she was asked to serve under two different governors, one Democrat and one Republican. We talk about how political polarization is affecting the nonprofit sector and the importance of identifying and focusing on common ground rather than differences. And we also discuss Liz's upbringing in eastern Montana, her passion for photography, and much more. I can't thank Liz enough for taking the time to share all of her wisdom and insights about this important, yet often not fully understood topic. You'll learn a lot from this episode, so I hope you enjoy it. There are a million things I want to talk to you about, and maybe the best thing we can start out with is, could you just talk a little bit about the Montana Nonprofit Association, kind of the history of the organization, and kind of a summary of what you guys do?
Sure. Montana Nonprofit Association, which for us we call MNA, and it doesn't mean merger and acquisition. We have 650 charitable nonprofit members from all across the state. Some of the largest nonprofits in the state, and then a lot of nonprofits that don't have any staff at all, very little money, that kind of thing. And our whole goal is to, starting with what we believe is that a strong nonprofit sector is really part of what makes Montana wonderful. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, we spend our time and energy and resources helping nonprofit leaders gain skills, help them gain their own ability to grow the organization, and get the resources they need. And also a lot around connecting folks with each other to learn from each other and then to be a unified voice in the policy environment. Where even though there are many, many issues and every nonprofit kind of has their own thing they're thinking about, there are these commonalities as well. And so we try to bring folks together in the policy arena.
Got it. And so I think, when people think of Montana, and people who listen to this podcast are from kind of all over the country and even the world, which is crazy. But, I think people think of Montana as the wide open spaces in the great American West. And I think last time I checked, there was a little over 1 million people living in Montana. So how many nonprofits are there in Montana, and how does that kind of stack up versus other Western states or other states in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, we have, usually we're kind of in a tussle with Alaska for the most nonprofits per capita.
Really?
Yeah. And one of the reasons is because of the geography. So a lot of states have just a couple of population centers, if you think about Seattle and Spokane and, or 2 or 3 population centers. And Montana really has 7, and they're small. They're considered rural, but most of them are. And then we have people who live far enough away from those places but need services. So there are these communities that are, 70 to 120 miles from one of the larger towns, and people still need, they still want the food bank and they want the Head Start program and these different things that, nonprofits bring to communities. And they're not going to go to, they're not going to drive 100 miles healthcare. They're not going to drive that far. So we do have a lot of nonprofits just because of the geography.
Mm-hmm. And so how many are we talking about?
Well, okay. In Montana total, there are like 11,000 nonprofits.
Wow.
And of those, about 8,000 or so are 501c3s. So those are the ones we think of the most, the charitable nonprofits.
Yep.
Of those, about 900 are Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, you're welcome, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, for the plug. And so
great.
we count them as, they are. We count them as one.
Okay.
And so we usually say there are about 7,200 nonprofits in the state, and about 2,200 of them have employees. So all the rest are like 4-H programs, little leagues, these organizations that are sometimes organized just for insurance purposes or so that they can collect donations, but they don't really, they don't have employees or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about Montana being towards the top as far as per capita nonprofits, and I mean, is that this is kind of a broad question, but is that a good or a bad thing? Like having that many nonprofits? How would you, when you think about it, knowing everything you know about nonprofits around the United States, is that more of a positive than a negative, or maybe somewhere in the middle?
Well, I might answer the question a different way. I think that nonprofits, that's like asking, are there too many businesses? It's like the market kind of takes care of whether there are too many, because nonprofits that don't, are unable to thrive, or they can't figure out that being a nonprofit doesn't mean you go into the red every year. That's like, no, that's not a nonprofit. That's something else. They go out of business. And so the nonprofits are a reflection of how we want Montana to be. And so it's not really a matter of too many. Although, people ask that all the time, are there too many? And I think they come and go, and we try to support folks that want to run the business well and want to have a solid board, be mission focused, and be effective. And when that happens, we think that's a good thing. Having said that, when people call and say, we're thinking about starting a nonprofit, our first question is, are you sure you want to do that? Because it's not like we have a shortage of nonprofits, and we'd much rather people work together, find someone else with a common interest if you can. And of course, the other problem is that we're so independent in Montana, independent minded, so everybody and right now, people getting out of college, they're like, I want to start a nonprofit, which is wonderful. But starting a nonprofit you can also commit your career to nonprofit work without starting one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm relatively new to the nonprofit world. I've spent the majority of my career in the business world, and then about 4 years ago, I moved over to a conservation nonprofit. And so it's funny because I served on boards and all that kind of thing, but I looking back, I did not fully understand the nonprofit world until I've been in it. And I always laugh at that idea about you don't have to, some people think nonprofits don't have to make a profit because a lot of them do go out of business because they're spending more money than they have. And I think that brings us to the subject of COVID because, that has been a huge impact across nonprofit, for-profit, everybody, government, anything you can think of. And I know when COVID started kind of descending almost exactly 2 years ago from when we were recording this, in my world, the conservation world, a lot of organizations were pretty quick to start cutting their budgets and even laying off people. Big, multinational conservation groups were laying off, 25% of their workforce in certain areas of Colorado. And so can you talk a little bit about how COVID has affected your day-to-day work or you were in this job for probably about 8 years before COVID hit. And so how did it change everything for you? And what did you see as your organization's role in kind of helping people figure this thing out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It did change everything. We are able to, we're not a place that has huge walk-in traffic, or anything like that. So we're able to work from home, which we did immediately. And I'm on the board of the National Council of Nonprofits, and I'd been at a meeting, in DC, February 20th, I think, and the CEO there had said, "Hey, we need to watch this COVID thing." And I kind of, rolled my eyes and thought, there you go, being an attorney again, And, boy, I got home and, like 2 weeks later, we had the staff in our conference room saying, we got to help people figure out how to get hand sanitizer and masks. Then the next week it was like, we got to help people figure out how to work from home. The next week it was, we got to help people figure out how to get funding. It was like it moved that fast. And we're extraordinarily fortunate to have the team in place, a very innovative and nimble kind of team that has a culture of doing what we need to do to get the job done. And we did. And we helped nonprofits in Montana. They were looking to us for information. What do we do? And we did town halls on HR, on finance, we had our congressionals on town halls. We had, all of that so that people had as much information as possible. And that's really our role there, was curating and getting information out. And every day it was like we would imagine kind of what do they need next. And so we were kind of constantly front wheel of the bike and trying to look further down the road than they were currently experiencing so that we could be what they saw when they came to the next question.
So in my world of conservation, it was very scary at first. And I think a lot of our funders who had generally been very generous with conservation and natural resources type funding, they very abruptly started putting all their funding towards first responder things and that makes perfect sense to me. But once that kind of got under control, I feel like as things evened out a bit, and I mean, relative compared to, in the middle of COVID, but as things evened out, it seemed that the nonprofit sector, at least in Colorado, kind of mimicked a lot of what you see in just the general economy. It was almost like there was this gap in the middle, and there were some organizations that did very, very well, kind of in the second half of COVID, and then others that went out of business. And like for us, a lot of what we do is local food production and open space. And both of those things were made very clear, the importance of those things during the early stages of COVID, when you went to the grocery store and there was nothing on the shelf. And so we were able to fundraise around that. But then there were plenty of other organizations that just couldn't fundraise. And so did you see similar things to that in Montana, kind of this gap between the haves and the have-nots of the nonprofit world?
Very much so. And we tend to think about nonprofits in two categories, in a sense, like the safety net nonprofits and then the Montana we love. And we would put conservation in the Montana we love. for the most part, as you say, there's more and more food sustainability and all of that that's happening with conservation. But very often in Montana, these are the big wide open spaces and the trails, and definitely the funding, donor funding, went to the safety net initially. And a lot of the funding that came through the government, initially the coronavirus relief funds, a lot of it was designated toward safety net, toward food stamps and housing security and senior services and all of those things, which is good. But it left out not only environment, but arts, the arts organizations. So those are the two big groups that I think experienced such a dramatic difference. And the difference between the two of them really is that the conservation organizations got, slammed in terms of people using outdoor space. Yeah. And so, they had all the care and feeding that goes into an environment and into trails and things like that. They were getting slammed, with use, but not the funding. With arts organizations, it was more like they shuttered just like a restaurant, because they rely on people. And so they had to figure out, well, our earned revenue has stopped completely. Donated revenue is going elsewhere. So the art organizations that did, well coming through really used PPP loans for employees or the EIDL, grants for employees, and then pivoted to online presence, So the organizations that weren't able to do that, I think it was really hard on them. We have not heard a ton about organizations going out, but I believe it's coming probably. I'd just be surprised. It's happening on the East Coast for sure. And we thought, in the first year, we were like, we got to get some stuff out there about mergers. And it just really, there's been some, but not a ton.
So, knowing your experience in the nonprofit sector, and it may be too early to answer this, but what are some lessons learned from this COVID pandemic? Because, is it like even something as technical as you need more cash on your balance sheet so that you can weather storms, whether it's another wave of COVID or whatever natural disaster comes? Are there any kind of major lessons learned that you guys have taken from this crazy time in history?
Well, I would like to think that one lesson is, more to the general public, the necessity of the nonprofit sector. Yeah. It's like these are folks that kept running domestic violence centers, kept running group homes for people with disabilities, even though they were afraid of their staff getting ill. They were doing that when schools shut, and schools needed to shut, childcare shut. So then you had line workers trying to go take care of people that couldn't take care of themselves. And in the case of disabilities, and they had no childcare. They didn't have the resource. It was just a very, very tough time for direct service workers. So the necessity of the sector would be one thing. I think another is to rethink everything around cash, and become comfortable with a reserve and not be okay with not having one. And that's a hard thing to say because nonprofits, we're a weird industry because some people don't even know you can work for a nonprofit. They think it's all volunteer. Yeah. You would be surprised how the people that say thank you all for volunteering. Really? It's like, oh yes. We could have a conversation about that, but
we had the opposite because my organization is now Palmer Land Conservancy, and it used to be Palmer Land Trust, and we're in this nice building downtown where the space is basically donated, and people would see Palmer Land Trust and they thought we were really rich, and they thought we were like a bank or something. So it's kind of maybe it's like everything, the extremes. Yeah.
Well, there are people who don't know that people work for nonprofits and that it's a career choice. So one thing that I would say is, the necessity for cash and rethinking, like getting into popping the hood on the nonprofit and looking at your business model, the scenario modeling and all of that. So that's one thing that we've really been able to be helpful to many nonprofits right now. Another thing is the well-being of the nonprofit community. I think it's the It's the sector that everybody just expects to keep stretching to meet the need. I mean, that's how we started, is we were all volunteer and there was a need. Nobody was meeting it. So somebody stepped up and eventually they created, the Salvation Army or the movements to make sure kids had what they needed. And there was a lot of sacrifice in the early culture of the nonprofit sector. And so it is still a mission and cause-driven sector, and it is still sacrificial. I mean, people generally don't make as much in the nonprofit sector. That's not true across the board. But I think it changed our perspective on what people need in reserve to deal with hard times. And we can't use people up and then ask them to be nimble and stretch more and work smarter, not harder, with less money. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And so people are leaving the nonprofit sector, because it's like they're burned out. I think the first year we were all like in this adrenaline mode and, rising to meet the crisis, which nonprofits are really good at. And then the second year, it was like, okay, we don't have the adrenaline, but really the crisis is still pretty much here. Yep. And we're just kind of trying to slog through it. And, all the adaptability and the resilience and kind of the innovation was pretty used up for many, many folks. Not everyone, but for many. And so we're pretty concerned about the nonprofit workforce and the value on employees. Mm-hmm. Every business knows that you take care of your employees first, and that's how you get the job done. That's how you meet your mission. And that's a hard one for nonprofits, not because they don't care about employees, but the resources to really pay a living wage, make sure people have child care, make sure people have access to medical care. Yeah, there are whole swaths of the sector that just still don't have that.
We're seeing down here in Colorado, at least in my organization, we've had some several open positions, and relative, as far as the scales of pay go and that kind of thing, they're right in line with what one could expect working in that level of that for an organization of our size, and we cannot fill the roles. It's not like you get a bunch of people and there's not a fit. I mean, it's like no applications come in, which blows my mind. So I guess, what is if you could wave a magic wand, is it pay increases across the board? I mean, what is the answer? Because I can't figure it out.
That's a complicated question, so okay. I'll just give you my best shot. Somewhat of it is conscientiously becoming the organization everyone wants to work for. So flexibility, benefits and pay, movement, so that people come in and they have a path for learning and growing. It's like dealing with a whole person now instead of an employee. And so that's a big part of it. And there's probably also with the number of people working from home, because the employment rates are back to where we want them to be, right? They're kind of pre-COVID. So what happened to all the people? So if people are working and they're working from home, kind of gig work, graphic designers and things like that, there's probably more call for that kind of staffing, where you're using contract workers and just a more flexible model of staffing. And then, of course, in an online world, figuring out how to really be a team, a cohesive team, is not easy. And so people have to figure that out. So there's no magic there. We're looking at, we're in a pilot program. It's this really cool international pilot program as an organization ourselves to try out a 4-day work week. Yeah. And, it's the idea is you figure out what productivity really looks like so that you don't lose productivity and you don't lose pay, but you lose 8 hours, or you gain it on the personal end. And so we're going to try that and just kind of see how it works. And if there's a model we can help people adopt and get the job done, that'll be kind of cool too.
When I hear you describe all that, I think it's this, again, it goes back to the idea that these nonprofits are businesses and it's a competitive business environment. And I think the things that you mentioned there, everybody from Google to the local hardware store down the street, they're all kind of struggling with that. How do we attract quality people? So I don't know. It definitely is a challenge. But
well, and along with that is we can do all we want with changing the taxes in Montana so they're lower, so we attract businesses and all that. But if they can't find housing, and that's really what's happening here is that housing is so bad. And, we have people coming out of school with tremendous student loan debt and inability, it's just like this insane model of expecting them to kind of work for nothing to get they can't. I was on a call the other day where somebody said, well, like this younger generation, wants more sooner. And it's like, well, they have a lot more debt. They have a lot more obligations. They have to have more in order to take a job. And they have to be able to move faster or they're going to just kind of lose hope,
Oh, yeah, definitely. Another question about COVID. I feel like in your position, you get exposed to so many great success stories across the whole map. So from the arts to conservation to healthcare, can you share a few kind of inspiring stories that you've seen that the specific role that nonprofits have been able to play and the people? One thing I think you said that nonprofits are the story of people. And I think I love that. And so could you just give a few examples of some of the best of people that you've seen during this crazy time?
One is, and the stories I know the best are the ones here in my own community, of course. But, I think about the arts organizations. So two in particular. One is the Helena Symphony and one is the Myrna Loy, which is a performing arts center and, or arts and culture center here. And, both of them really retooled to go to digital. And, but the reason they did it wasn't, part of it, of course, is to stay in business.
Yep.
But it was because art heals. And that was the message from both of them. We need art right now because art heals. And I think the outdoors, that is a message that resounds with the outdoors as well. We can still be a community in the outdoors. And so that was inspiring. And then we saw some collaboration between organizations that both needed staff, but in different ways at different times. So I can't remember the exact story, but it was like one person had bus drivers, another person had cooks, and they figured out how they could meet each other's needs with the same set of staff and stay open, and get the job done. And so there was a lot of collaboration like that. And then there were people that just, figured out how to work with the local businesses, for example, nonprofits that provided shelter, working with hotels and motels to make sure that they could have non-congregate shelter so people could live, in their own room. And then domestic violence centers that figured the same thing out, how do we serve clients in a safe way, but not all in this place where, they may be exposed to COVID. I remember one a former board member who now runs, one of the larger food pantries in the state, who was on an advisory group. We had pulled together an advisory group that met every week with, different subsectors so that we were really staying in tune with what was going on with every different subsector. And this guy was like, I don't have time to apply for a loan because, for the PPP loan, because we're just so busy getting the food out the door. So there were those kinds of things where people just were of service.
And for people who listen to this podcast a lot, if you haven't listened to the episode I did with Matt Pearson of the Producer Partnership, he's a rancher who got some funding from the Arthur Blank Foundation and other organizations, and really came up with a really innovative. So that's about an hour and 15-minute long conversation about another success story in Montana. So I'd encourage people to listen to that if they haven't already. When you're explaining all that, kind of the word that keeps coming into my brain is generosity, because of the generosity of the individuals that are out there doing this important work, and they're not getting paid a lot to do it generally, or maybe not getting paid at all if they're volunteers. And then the generosity of the individuals who have donated to these nonprofits or the foundations and who fund a lot of this work. And then you go up a level, whoever made the money to begin with and then created the foundation, which does all this important work. So But I think sometimes when people hear, and my background, I got an MBA, and that which can make you kind of cold and hard sometimes. And when I hear the word generosity and business, I think, oh, that's feel good stuff. I don't know if that's sustainable. So how do you think about the soft, high level term of generosity when you think about the importance of this work?
I think that nonprofits give others the chance to make communities the way we want to be, even when those people aren't in a position to do that themselves. And so nonprofits rely on generosity of every kind,
Yes.
So starting with a generous spirit with the board and the optimism and the belief that, we will get through this, and board members supporting staff who support constituents. That generosity of spirit is like the sound of the bagpipe behind everything. It's humming along while everything else goes. And so there's that kind of generosity. We saw nonprofits really push to buy local and to support local businesses, to buy gift cards, for folks instead of buying from, a box company or something like, the big box chains. In order to just recognizing that businesses were really going through a hard time, and how could nonprofits be of support. And so we saw that kind of generosity, and of course the generosity of businesses who were just tapped. And I think that was hard. That was hard for nonprofits. My sense is there was quite a bit of respect for what businesses were going through. And a lot of nonprofits rely on their partnerships with government. It's not all donations. The foundation community was amazing. And so for those nonprofits who are fortunate enough to have grants, the foundation community in Montana just kind of came around and said, what do you really need? What, and we experienced that, and I know others did too, just like, what can we do to help keep this work going and make it work? I think one of the gifts of COVID was really seeing what inequity plays out like, and we talk about equity, and I live a life of privilege. There's a lot I don't understand about it. But knowing that, in Montana, for example, the tribal communities, it was like protect them, just protect them. These leaders, if they pass on, they lose their history, because it's an oral history and all of that. So I think the health inequities and food inequities and, all of that, we became more clear on. And I think as a society, that's a gain if we do something with it.
Well, that brings me to another question I have. When we were talking on the phone, I guess last week, we were talking about, I was telling you about when I started this podcast, and how when I started it, I was living in Boulder, which is notoriously left-leaning, but I was working with a lot of folks in the agricultural community, which is more right-leaning. And what I noticed was that there was this big overlap between the most hardcore environmentalist in Boulder and the kind of toughest old rancher you could ever find. There was a lot, if you think about it as a Venn diagram, there was this huge overlap of a love for the land, a respect for the land. But a lot of that doesn't come through. And so that was 6 years ago when I started this podcast. And I feel like things have just gotten more and more and more and more polarized. And while they very well may still have that common ground, in the Venn diagram, I feel like on the far extremes of both sides, people are getting more and more angry and more, or less and less willing to, come together over something as simple as being generous, And so how have you been navigating that? I mean, that's a big question, I know, but how has this political climate, or I don't even know if it's political, it might be cultural climate. How has that affected your ability to do your job and the organizations you work with?
Well, I think it's hard because, first of all, I love that you said, there was this big Venn diagram. I thought you were going to say there was this big divide. And it felt so great to hear you say there was this big common ground,
Sure.
And I think as a democracy, I have felt it, or I believe that the nonprofit sector is an expression of democracy, right? It's how the people want life to be for ourselves and other people. So we have government, we have business, and then we have this thing about quality of life. And that's where the nonprofit sector often sits. It's how we want it to be. And so we're sometimes called the civil society. And in other countries, nonprofits are called the civil society organizations because we are in other countries that don't have as strong a democracy, nonprofits are really the seeds of the voice of the people. And so, yes, it's tough. And we are asked to be nonpartisan, and we are rigorously nonpartisan. It's hard in Montana because our state is, we have, factually, we have a more red state now than we did. We had for many years a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. Now it's, every office, top down is R. And that's fine, but it is more to the right. So if we're a middle organization and we don't move because we want to occupy middle space and the whole landscape shifts to the right, we are now more left. And we haven't done a thing, And so, and it's hard because if you drive with a flag on your truck, it's a symbol. If you wear a mask, it's a symbol. All these things are symbols that don't need to be, but we've made them that way. And so to be effective and to think about things around equity and what a human and humane response is to inequity, doing that without being, kind of typecast as one side or the other, it should just be humanity, And so that is harder. And we have a public policy arm. We're a staff of 7. So when I say arm, I mean me. So we all have something we do, right? And so, we're doing public policy work around the good of the nonprofit sector and more paying attention to civil dialogue, civic engagement. That's not, is it necessary to the nonprofit sector that we all get to vote? Is it necessary that people all get counted in a census? If we are the voice of the people, then it probably is. But even those words take on a tone and a meaning that it's assigned to a political party and doesn't need to be. I'm so glad to see more voice right now around this middle ground and common ground than I have for a long time. And it's something I'm passionate about. I teach a public policy course at University of Montana. And we start by talking about the middle ground and what that is and campaign finance and how much that's impacted the extremes. So, if campaign finance changed, would that change the equation? Perhaps, but who's going to vote for that if they're, the winners right now?
Yeah.
And so it's a complicated issue, and I could talk all day about it, but.
Well, that brings me to my next question that I want to make sure I read correctly, that you were on the coronavirus task force with Governor Bullock, and then you're on it now, or you were also on it with Governor Gianforte, and that seems impossible to me these days that you could do both. Is that true? Did I read something wrong?
No, that is true, and that was
amazing.
A compliment.
I mean, that is really. I truly don't understand. That speaks volumes to your ability to be reasonable and rational and that's the greatest compliment ever, I would think.
It is a compliment. Yeah. It really is. And honestly, it's a compliment to us to be asked by Governor Bullock, but I have to say it's a compliment to Governor Gianforte to choose somebody that maybe would, be of a different ilk or whatever, and to be able to look past that and just think, what do we do to get the job done here? So I think the compliment really is to those choosers, and certainly it's a compliment to me and to us as well. And I think we were able to do some good. I know with the coronavirus relief fund, the COVID task force was a little bit harder. I'm so grateful that I was there and able to kind of be the voice for the nonprofit community. And we had, as I said, we set up advisory groups. We did a lot of kind of focus group phone calls just to stay in touch with where people were so that we could represent them well. And I loved doing that. The ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act funds, I will say the nonprofits in Montana feel, not maybe across the board, but many nonprofits feel kind of locked out of that whole thing because it's very technical, but it's like it's all going to infrastructure and water and sewer and broadband, which are all great things. But, in some states, nonprofits have been able to get, a $15 million pool for a grant fund or something like that just to help nonprofits recover.
Yeah.
And that really hasn't been the case in Montana. We went a very different route, which has been hard. And sitting on the National Council board and hearing these stories about, what's happening in other states, it's like, no, I want some of that.
Well, where do you see things going in the nonprofit sector in the coming, 5 years? It's kind of crazy to try to forecast anything beyond 5 years. And if anything, the last 2 years have shown us how quickly things can change. But I mean, where do you see things when you kind of think about, all right, this is what the landscape's going to look like? And I know it's a very broad question because you serve so many different kind of sectors, from the arts to conservation to healthcare. So what are you thinking about when you think about the future, opportunities, challenges, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that probably the first thing I think about is story and reputation, believe it or not. I think that we are so into a soundbite mentality that getting attention and saying not all nonprofits are the same, just like not all businesses are the same. Not all nonprofits are political, but the ones that are political and are pushing for candidates and all this are making a lot of noise, the big money, the dark money, all of that. Most nonprofits aren't in that lane. And so how we protect the brand of the sector and protect our reputation, because that's our currency. That it really is. And that's why when a nonprofit goes south, or does wrong, it's stunning because we don't expect it. And it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And so I think finding a different way to tell the value of the nonprofit sector and what we bring. And it's tough because nonprofits are in this position of getting their money from others, not customers. We don't get our money from our customers. We spend it on our customers. So we get our money from partnerships with government. We're more efficient. We're more well-trusted, frankly. And we're in the community. And so we're more beloved than government. And so we have partnerships, contracts with government. And we get money from donations. So I think there's this sense that, nonprofits are constantly asking, if we are going to fulfill our role in our society and in our communities, we have to ask. And that means we have to go to the legislature and say, this is the job you've asked us to do. We can't even meet licensure requirements without holding bake sales. But we're not asking bridge builders to hold bake sales. And we're not asking railroads to hold bake sales, And so I think that culture of asking, we have to really tell that story well too. So it's the reputation as politics get crazier, and then how we tell the story of the value we bring, I think is critical. And then, society probably needs to get more comfortable with the fact that nonprofit is not a business model. It's a tax status.
Yes. I think that's great. That's a good soundbite.
And we've got to protect that. And, our tax system reflects our values. And so we are valued, and we have to protect that, and we need society to protect it alongside us.
When you back out, beyond COVID and just think about nonprofits in general, are there any common themes that come to your mind when you think about, all right, having this characteristic makes a successful nonprofit? Like in the conservation world, I always think about the work has to be locally driven. Like it can't be me sitting in Colorado Springs telling somebody in Pueblo what to do with their irrigated farmland. It has to be the farmers have this great idea and we come in and help facilitate the local idea. It's not anything about me. It's all about them. And that's what I've seen. Anybody who hasn't had success in the conservation, I feel like they're trying to, put their ideas on somebody. So, but is there anything like that you could even take a few steps out for the whole nonprofit? Just characteristics of successful nonprofit, effective nonprofits?
I think you do everything you can to do a good job. And that's where I think organizational development comes in. So we think about child development. It's like when the kid is 3, you're not reading books about an 18-year-old. You're reading books about 3-year-olds, and you're figuring out how to get to 18. And So that's simplistic, but that's part of it is, you need a strong financial foundation. The board is everything. And so, there's a lot around cultivating a board and the board understanding the duties of care and loyalty and obedience and what that really means on the ground, So, yeah, there's just plain old operating capacity nonprofits need. And I don't know if nonprofits can succeed unless they really resonate with who they're serving. So whether it's a Head Start program and you're working with families that don't have very much, or a program in homelessness, or a conservation program or an arts program, you have to find that audience and have those authentic relationships, authentic and respectful relationships. And to the degree that you can do that, the mission has a chance.
Well, I need to know more about you specifically. How did you end up doing this work? Because you're obviously very good at it. I'm glad you're applying your passion and skills and brain power to this instead of like mergers and acquisitions at Goldman Sachs. Not that that's a bad thing.
Thank you. Yeah.
But yeah. Tell me your background.
Well, I grew up in eastern Montana. My dad's a rancher.
What part?
Miles City area.
Oh, I love it out there. And it took me a while to fall in love with it because I was so obsessed with the big mountains.
Yeah.
But once you get that prairie in your blood, there's nothing like it.
There is nothing like it. Yeah. It's home. And I love eastern Montana. And we work really hard to be of service to nonprofits in eastern Montana. It's hard because rural Montana just doesn't have as many resources, So that's one of the gifts of COVID too, is we're able to be more expansive in our reach, and because of Zoom, frankly, and I don't love it, but it is a gift as well. So Dad was a rancher. He lives in Fromberg now, which is a little town outside of Billings, and he moved to Fromberg to be closer to medical care, which I think is just so funny because most of us think like move to Billings to be close to medical care. Yeah. But Fromberg has, they have Red Lodge and they have Fromberg, they have care. So I grew up there. And then as a teenager, my parents divorced. And I think, I lived in another state for a few years, but lived on the ranch in the summer. And I think that really solidified my sense of the importance of community and how Montana is home to me. Not everyone would feel that way, but for me, I'm like a cat on a screen door with Montana. I'm like, this is my place. And so
I can understand why. That's cool.
Yeah, it really is. And I just think how extraordinarily lucky I am to be living in a place where the beauty is inescapable. And my job is to drive around in that beauty and meet people doing work to keep it beautiful and to make life good for Montana and Montanans. I'm just a lucky person.
But how did you decide to be in this line of work? Because again, seems to me you could do anything you wanted to do. And so why, you could have been a doctor, you could have been an investment banker, you could have been an Exxon oil driller. Could have been, but you're not. So
I don't know how it all happened. I think that, honestly, I just have a deep sense of spirituality and what community is. And I swear like a trooper. So when I say spirituality, I really do mean, spirituality. Like I believe so much that we all belong, and that's just in me. And I can't not do that work. I have to make myself walk away from causes, because it's like, no, don't take on another one. And my parents brought me up with a sense of spirituality. And while I don't have that same pathway now, that deep sense of something holy about life and respect for people, and that we all reach our potential, and we don't. But I believe in that. And I believe that it matters that we put our resources there. So I don't know exactly how to explain it. Maybe it's like a calling, I don't know, but it's my work and I know it is.
Well, I was 40, I'm 44 now, and I was 40 when I finally made the full-time move over to conservation, and I'd been working really hard, and I thought I was enjoying it in the business world for quite a while. And like I said, like got my MBA. I went to business school to get my MBA to be a real estate developer, which is pretty hilarious because now I'm on
now you're in conservation.
Yeah, I'm on the complete opposite end. But I mean, I love all the experiences I had. It made me better at what I do now. But like, say I was a 22-year-old getting ready to graduate from college, and I came to you for advice, and I said, all right, I can follow my something that I feel like I'm very excited about, which is conservation, or I can go work at this publicly traded real estate development company. And those were kind of like, they were my options at one point. And I'm not trashing publicly traded real estate investment companies at all, but what would be your advice to somebody like me who, is at a fork in the road? What would be your career advice? It's
kind of funny because my nephew he lived with us for 4 months this summer while he was trying to figure that out. And he did an internship at Prickly Pear Land Trust during that time.
Yeah. I've heard great things about them. I've heard such great things about them.
Oh, they're so great. You really need to meet Mary Hollow and her crew.
I bet you're like the 10th person to tell me that. So it finally is going to get through this thick skull of mine. Okay. I will do it because everybody keeps telling me that. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. I would say, first of all, you're not walking off a cliff, probably, whatever decision you're making. You can always unreel a decision or make a different decision. And I think that's really important for young people to know because there's this fear of, I don't know the right thing. And it's like, there probably are like a multitude of right things and very few wrong things. So, that would be the first thing. And then I would say that working in nonprofits, it can be a viable career path. It might mean that you're living on less, or something like that. So you got to figure out how to make all that work, but it is a viable and joyful career path. And if it's in you, then it's just like getting to do what you love every day. I mean, following your values and your heart that way. I think it's important. And but I would stop short of a recommendation. I generally try not to do that. I just think, you will figure it out, and this may be where you land. And there are people who are suited for business.
Yeah.
And we need that, There are people suited for government. I am not one of them, but I'm glad they exist.
Yeah. And you can combine them, I mean, we were introduced by the great folks at the Blank Foundation, and Mr. Blank is a perfect example of just a true business genius who also is one of the most impactful philanthropists around. So I think none of this stuff is mutually exclusive. And if anything, like if somebody was talking about a 40-year-old when I was 23, I would have thought they were talking about like a senior citizen. And it took me and I made a pretty big switch as a senior citizen.
Yeah,
so
that's exactly right.
Last thing I want to talk about on your personal front is I just discovered that you are a ridiculously talented photographer. How did that come into play?
Well, thank you.
It's really, it's amazing. I mean, I like to fancy myself a bit of a photographer, as I guess anybody does these days, but your stuff is, I don't know if you sell that stuff, but it's great.
Thank you. I think that was probably one of the things that kind of got me through COVID. I've taken pictures all my life. Again, my mom was a photographer. And so I started with a Nikon early on and just stuck with Nikon. But I don't know when I got serious about it. I guess I'm a learner. And at some point, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was like I had done enough picture taking to just finally decide, okay, I'm going to throw myself into this a little bit. And I do some challenges online that give you a lot of tutorials. And it's like every Sunday night at 10 o'clock, you get a new challenge and you have to submit a photo you took that next week.
Oh, cool.
By 10 o'clock the next Sunday night. It is, because otherwise you take pictures of what you like, rather than stretching to learn new things, And so I think that really helped me do that. And I just, I'm a musician and I have that creative sense. And I'm so grateful for that, because a lot of my job, as wonderful as it is, I wouldn't necessarily call it creative. There's an administrative part of it. So that's a big joy to me. But thank you. And I drive Montana. So how can you go wrong? There's so much to see that's just exquisite.
Yeah, well, I found your website and I wanna dig into it more, because it's I don't know, I'm with you that there's part of that. There's this need for creativity that I'm very impressed. I read a ton of books, and I'm always looking for good book recommendations. And the folks that listen to this podcast are always, I think that the book recommendations, they like those a lot more than they like listening to me talk. But can you recommend a few books, and they don't have to be about conservation or the West or anything, but just books that maybe have been important to you and help kind of develop you into the person that you are now?
Well, let's see. I'm a reader. I like well-written books. So I always just think of the latest books I've read. In my work, there's a book called Governance as Leadership. And I think the important thing about that book is that it talks about generative thinking. And so it's kind of like, how do you approach things not in the nuts and bolts sense, but how do you think about what questions should I be asking in this situation? Yeah. And if we can learn to ask ourselves, what are the questions I should be asking? Then we're creating a context for the rest of it instead of just kind of throwing spaghetti on the wall, hoping that something will stick, So that was a good book for me. Maybe I'll email you a couple books.
Yeah. Are you more of a fiction or nonfiction person?
I am more of a fiction person. So like right now, I know that I think it's pronounced Amor Towles, who wrote Gentleman in Moscow, wrote another book that I just read and can't remember the title, but he's going to actually be in Helena in April, and I can't wait. I'm going to go hear him. And then I read a book that I thought was astonishing. It was Doris Kearns Goodwin on leadership.
Yeah, I haven't read that, but I love her.
Yeah.
And I know the book. I heard a lot of interviews with her when she was promoting it. So it's pretty good. I
think it's excellent. For a person who's not a huge nonfiction fan, it is so well written. It's captivating. I really couldn't put it down. And it's 4 presidents and kind of chronicling their leadership. So I read quite a bit on leadership. I'm always learning.
That's
because
great.
I am not a fully baked cookie. Not yet.
Good.
Yeah.
Me neither.
Yeah.
That'd be boring if we were.
Yes,
right?
it would.
Any parting words? The folks that listen to this podcast, they're from all over, but they feel a connection with the West, whether that's through the landscape, through conservation, through coming out and hiking or doing ultra marathons or through art. Just this, people feel a connection to the West, and they respect the West, and they've grown as human beings because of their love of the West. So any kind of parting words that you'd like to leave for everybody? Well,
probably if they scratch the surface of why they come to the West and what they love, they will find nonprofits there. And so I think, advice would be leave it a little bit better than you found it. And then in the tradition I was brought up in, we give to what we believe in and can't give to everything. So if you believe in that cause, if you believe in conservation of the arts or whatever, while you're touristing, also give. And, it's an important part of, especially in a state like Montana with small government and a big geography, it's really important. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's great. I love it. Thank you so much. This was unbelievable. It was educational. It was inspirational. I'm just, it gets me more excited. I'm excited to publish a podcast, but then it gets me more excited about my work in conservation. And so that's great. I really appreciate everything you're doing. It's really great to meet you and keep up the great work. Thank you. Thanks so much. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend.
But thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.